The candle had burned to a stub before anyone thought to look for her, and by then, the wrong sister was already dressed in white. Mira did not hear the argument that decided her fate. She heard only its aftermath, the soft click of the parlor door, her mother's footstep retreating down the corridor with the particular lightness of a woman who has gotten what she wanted, and then the long, airless silence that followed, pressing against the walls of the house like weather. She was sitting at the escritoire in the East Room, cataloging her father's correspondence by date and sender in the manner she had taught herself at 15, when the silence was broken by her younger sister Cecily flying through the door with her cheeks flushed and her curls disordered, and the expression of a woman who has narrowly escaped a sentence. "It is settled," Cecily said, and the way she said it was not a comfort. "Mother has arranged it with Lady Aldecroft. You are to go in my place." Mira set down the letter she was holding, corner to corner with the rest. "In your place to what?" "To Gravenmore, to marry the Duke." She had heard of the Duke of Gravenmore the way one hears of weather that is happening in another county, as a fact of the world, not a fact of one's own life. Tall, severe, the estate entailed in unusual ways. A young wife dead 3 years past under circumstances no one discussed in plain sentences. Mira was not the sister anyone had imagined sending there. She knew this without bitterness. She had catalogued the arithmetic of her family's calculations long before she catalogued their correspondence. Cecily was admired. Cecily sang like a bell and laughed on cue, and could make a drawing room turn toward her like flowers toward a window. Mira could read a man's intention from his hands and tell a forged signature from a true one at 12 paces, and these were not gifts Whitmore society had found occasion to reward. "You told them I do not speak," Mira said. Cecily had the grace to look at the carpet. "I told them you are. Quiet, very quiet. By nature. Cecily, I may have implied that you suffer from an affliction of the voice." The words came fast, tumbling. Mother was desperate, Mira, and Lord Fenwick had all but offered, and I could not. "I cannot go to that house. Everyone says it is wretched. Everyone says he is wretched. And you are so much better at wretched than I am. You always have been. You can manage anything. And it is only until Christmas, because surely by Christmas you will find some way to what?" Mira said. "Dissolve a marriage?" The silence that followed was its own answer. Mira looked at her hands, which were perfectly still, because she had learned to keep them perfectly still when she was thinking most precisely. She thought, there is a duke, there is a great house, there is a family that has just delivered her into a lie that will require constant maintenance or catastrophic confession, one or the other, before the year is out. She thought, it is the 14th of September, and the arrangement is to be formalized at the month's end, which means she has 16 days to understand what she is walking into, and understanding is always better done early. She had not yet considered that understanding might be the one thing this particular arrangement would not allow her. She would think of that later, when it was too late for it to matter, and she would be glad. The Duke of Gravenmore arrived to collect his promised bride on a Tuesday, in a coach that was neither ostentatious nor mean, drawn by 4 horses of a quality that spoke of use rather than display. Mira watched him descend from the window of the East Room, which afforded the best angle for watching anything, and she categorized what she saw with the same methodical care she gave to correspondence. Tall, as reported. The gravity was there, the worn quality of a man who had spent considerable energy on something that had not, in the end, held. His hands were bare in the cold and looked capable. He did not look at the house the way men who are proud of their power look at things they are acquiring. He looked at it the way a man looks at a problem he has already committed to solving. His name was Edmund Ashcroft, which was not a name anyone in the house had thought to mention to Mira until 3 days prior. She descended to the parlor. Her mother stood beside the fireplace with a smile that Mira recognized as the one deployed for audiences from whom something specific was required. Cecily was not present. Cecily had developed a convenient indisposition and taken to her room with the strategic cowardice of someone who has lit a fire and cannot be bothered to watch it burn. Edmund Ashcroft turned when Mira entered and looked at her, and she saw the assessment happen. Quick, thorough, nothing like a husband's appraisal. And then it was done, and he simply inclined his head. Her mother spoke for her, as arranged. The affliction of the voice, so unfortunate, quite severe. She manages beautifully. Nonetheless, Mira stood and met his eyes and watched his face for the reaction. What she found was not the pity or the polite calculation she had expected. There was something that might have been careful attention and something else below it that she could not yet name. He said, "I see," and his voice was level, and he looked at Mira, not at her mother, when he said it. That was the first thing she noted. The parlor held one other person, a man of 40 or so, standing slightly behind the Duke with the practiced ease of someone long accustomed to being in important rooms without being addressed in them. His name, she would learn, was Mr. Corwin Vane, the estate's steward, the Duke's cousin by a secondary branch, present to manage documents. He was immaculate. His smile, when deployed, was a perfect instrument. He looked at Mira once, briefly, with an expression that she might have called politely sympathetic, and she filed it beside the other things she had noted, and said nothing. Because she was not yet permitted to say anything. The agreement was formalized. The 16th of October was named as the date. Mira had until then to become someone who did not speak, or to find a different way through, which amounted to the same problem at different ends. She did not show that she knew this. She had, at 26, accumulated considerable practice in not showing what she knew. The coach that took her to Gravenmore 3 weeks later traveled south by east through countryside she had never seen, past estates she would not have been able to name, in the company of the Duke and his steward and her own maid, a woman of 50, named Beck, who had served the family since before Mira was born, and who had been the first to know the truth, and the first to say, with characteristic economy, "Well, we manage with what we're given." Beck had a way of pressing her thumbnail against her forefinger. When she was thinking that Mira had watched for so long, it had become a kind of second clock. She was pressing it now, watching the countryside, saying nothing. Edmund Ashcroft sat across from Mira and did not make conversation in the way of someone performing courtesy. He made it in the way of someone genuinely uncertain what instrument to play, given the apparent constraint. He said at one point that the road would be better after they crossed the river. He said at another that the east wing of the house had been recently replastered and was habitable again. He said these things and watched her face after them, not with expectation, but with the attention of someone waiting to read the weather. Mira had brought a small notebook, the kind she used for correspondence logs. She wrote, "Thank you," and turned it toward him. He read it. Something shifted in the set of his mouth. Not a smile, not quite, and he said, "You're welcome," as if it were the most ordinary transaction in the world, and looked out the window, and the countryside continued past. She would remember that moment afterward, when she was cataloging the evidence of his character. It was the way he had not made anything of it, the way he had simply accepted the channel she offered and moved through it without comment or performance. It told her something, though she could not yet say what. Mr. Corwin Vane, sitting beside the Duke, watched this exchange with an expression that was perfectly composed, and Mira thought, very slightly calculating. He had soft hands for a steward. Gravenmore was larger than she had pictured and quieter than she had feared. The housekeeper was a Mrs. Pollard, a stout woman of solid judgment who took one look at Mira's notebook and said, without being asked, "We will manage perfectly well, Your Grace," with an emphasis on perfectly that suggested she had managed perfectly well through considerably worse and did not anticipate difficulty. The staff received her with the careful neutrality of people who are forming opinions they are not yet prepared to commit to. The house smelled of beeswax and something herbal that she could not immediately identify, and the floors in the east wing were as new as reported, pale against the older stone of the rest. Her rooms had a window that faced the kitchen garden. She stood at it the first evening and looked down at the beds, still holding their autumn growth, and identified rosemary and rue, and something at the far end whose silvery leaves she would need to examine more closely. There was a lemon thyme edging the southernmost bed that caught the last of the light and glowed for a moment before the dusk took it, and she thought, well, one begins somewhere. She had been at Gravenmore 11 days when she discovered that the household accounts had been keeping a secret. It was not intentional discovery. She had not been invited to review the accounts. No one had suggested she had any business with them. They were Mr. Vane's domain, organized in ledgers he kept in the estate room off the library, and she had been given no reason to open them. She had been given Beck, her rooms, and the freedom of the house, and a husband who appeared for dinner and did not make her feel his silence as a weight. What she had been given, beyond these things, was time. And time was what she had always needed. She found the first discrepancy on a Wednesday, in a manner so ordinary it might have been a joke. She had wanted lavender oil for the small still she had discovered in the still room, a lovely piece of equipment, long unused, smelling of old flowers and copper, and had gone to ask the housekeeper whether a purchase might be arranged, and Mrs. Pollard had consulted the household supply ledger, and something in the column of figures was wrong. Not wrong as in mistaken, wrong as in impossible. A delivery from the apothecary in August, paid twice, to the same order, on the same date, with 2 different amounts. Mira looked at it for the length of time it takes to draw a breath. She copied the entry into her notebook. She thanked Mrs. Pollard for her time and went back to the still room and stood in the smell of old lavender and thought about what a steward with soft hands and a perfect smile might do with the difference between one payment and another. Over a period of time she did not yet know. She thought about the first thing she had noticed about Mr. Corwin Vane, which was the way he had looked at her once with an expression she had filed as politely sympathetic. She thought about it differently now. She said nothing. She had become rather good at that. The Duke found her in the still room that afternoon. She did not hear him approach. He moved quietly for a large man and became aware of his presence only when his shadow fell across the workbench, where she was categorizing the unlabeled tins she had found in the upper cupboard by their contents. She did not startle. She looked up, and he looked at the tins and then at her, and said, "I didn't know anyone still used this room." She wrote, "It is a fine room. It would be finer with a dedicated supply of lavender." He read this and looked at the bench and said, "There was a garden when my grandmother was alive. Most of it is still there." He paused. "I could show you, if you wanted." She looked at him. She had been watching his face for 11 days now, with the same systematic attention she gave to anything she needed to understand, and she had built up a picture that was at some variance with the reports she had heard. He was not wretched. He was someone on the far side of a great loss who had forgotten or possibly never learned how to occupy a room without bracing for a blow. His hands, which she had classified as capable in the first look, were also careful, the way he handled objects, the way he moved through doorways, as if he had spent a long time practicing the absence of impact. His first wife had died in this house. She did not know the manner of it, and it was not yet her business to ask. She had filed the question under, later. She wrote, "I would like that." The garden was half wild and entirely beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been left to become themselves, and he walked through it with her at the unhurried pace of someone who had not walked through it in some time and was not sure how he felt about that. He knew the names of things, which surprised her. He named them without showing off, the way you name things that have always been there. She wrote a question about the tall silver-leaved plant at the back, and he said, "Artemisia. My grandmother used it in moth sachets. It smells like," he paused, "I don't know what it smells like. Here," and he pinched a sprig and held it out, and the scent was dry and clean and slightly astringent. And she thought, she was not sure why, of winter coming. She looked up to find him watching her, not the plant. She did not look away first. "You read lips," he said. "It was not a question. When I speak, you watch my mouth." At dinner, also, she had not intended him to notice this. She wrote, carefully, "It helps me to follow the shape of words. I find it useful in any case." He read this and read it again and said nothing for a moment, and she watched whatever he was thinking move through the set of his shoulders without arriving at his face. He said, "I owe you an honest house. I am aware I have not been entirely. That is to say, the arrangement was made quickly, and I did not have sufficient time to." He stopped. He was a man who had difficulty finishing certain sentences, she was learning. Not from evasion, but from some habitual economy with his own requirements, as if stating them plainly felt excessive. "If there is anything that would make this easier for you, I hope you will find a way to tell me." She wrote, "There is something I would like to see. The household accounts for the last 18 months. She turned the notebook toward him and watched his face. He read it. He looked up. Something in his expression sharpened without sharpening, became more still, which on him was the same thing. "Why?" he said. She wrote, "Because I believe someone has been making arithmetic that does not belong to them, and I believe I can prove it if I am allowed to look." The stillness held for a long moment, and then he said, "Come with me," and walked back toward the house, and she followed him, and behind them the artemisia went on releasing its clean, cold scent into the afternoon. She had the accounts by evening. She had the pattern by the following morning. What she had found in the supply ledger was not an isolated error, but a thread. And the thread, when pulled, led through 6 years of systematic double billing, diverted interest, and, she paused at this, smoothing the page, because the implications required careful handling, a set of entries for medicines supplied to the late Duchess that did not match the apothecary's official ledger, which she had found tucked in the back of a supply drawer with a notation in a different hand. She copied everything into her own notebook in the particular shorthand she had developed for correspondence work, column by column, date by date, amount by amount. Beck brought her tea at midnight and set it beside her without comment and pulled her own chair to the fire with the air of a woman settling in for a siege. "Mira," Beck said. After a time. She looked up. "Whatever you have found," Beck said, "be very certain before you are visible about it." She already knew this. The accounts were evidence of a steward's fraud, which was serious. The apothecary entries were evidence of something else, and something else was not a thing to bring before any witness until she understood its exact shape. She needed to know what had been in those medicines. She needed to know who had ordered them. She needed to know, with the precision of a woman presenting a case rather than an accusation, exactly what had been done in this house and by whom and to what end, because the only thing more dangerous than a man with 6 years of stolen money behind him was a man who understood that she was looking for it. She had 16 days until Christmas, which was the date her mother had apparently given as the outer limit of the arrangement. She had found this in a letter among her father's papers, copied in a hand she had learned to recognize for its particular spacing. 16 days to become certain, and to become visible in the right room at the right moment with the right witnesses behind her. She had managed with less time before. She had never, it was true, managed with precisely this much at stake. She had not yet decided what she thought about the man whose house this was, and whose face she had been reading for 11 days now, the man who had brought her a sprig of artemisia to smell, and who had said, "I owe you an honest house." She had noted the words and their weight, and set them beside everything else she was holding, and proceeded. She was, after all, very good at proceeding. The fortnight that followed had the texture of a clock being wound too tightly. She was careful. She understood that a woman who does not speak draws no particular notice in a great house. She moves through it quietly. She is in rooms without being of them. She sees what the noise of a room conceals, and she used this with the same deliberateness with which she had always used invisibility. Which was to say, completely. She was in the library when Mr. Vane met with a man she did not know, who arrived without being announced and left by the garden gate. She was at the still-room window when a packet was delivered by a boy, and signed for not by the housekeeper but by Vane himself, who turned it in his hands before pocketing it with the specific smoothness of a man who has done this before. She noted the date, the time, the boy's age, the direction from which he had come, and went back to her work. She was also, she noted this separately, in a column she did not show to Beck, present for the moment the Duke entered the dining room on a Thursday, and found that she had reorganized the seating arrangement to accommodate old Mr. Parsons, the estate's retired head groom, who had appeared at the door with a message, and whom Vane had left standing in the entrance hall in the cold. Edmund Ashcroft looked at the adjusted table, at Parsons now seated near the fire with a cup of something warm, and at Mira. He said nothing. But the line of his shoulders changed, and she wrote it down. She was there when the Duke laughed for the first time. It was small, barely a laugh at all, more the surrender of a laugh that had been firmly denied permission. And it happened because of Beck, who had delivered her verdict on the Gravenmore cook's method of managing an almond pudding with the blunt efficiency of a woman who considers silence in such matters an ethical failing. The Duke looked at Beck, and then at Mira, and the laugh escaped, and he looked almost surprised by it, and she thought, there it is. She did not write it down. She did not need to. It was Vane who forced the clock to the wall. She had gone to the estate room on the pretense of returning a ledger, which was entirely legitimate. She had been given access, and she had learned to make every visit legitimate on its face, and found a letter on the desk that was not intended for her eyes. It was from a solicitor in London, and it pertained to a disputed inheritance left to the late Duchess, and the question of who might have standing to claim it if the marriage to the present Duke were found to have been contracted under misrepresentation. The word misrepresentation was underlined in Vane's hand. He had been in the room. She had not heard the door behind her. "You read very quickly," he said, and his voice was entirely pleasant. "It is a remarkable gift in someone of your constraints." She turned. He was standing between her and the door with his arms at his sides and his expression composed and gentle, which she had learned was the manner he preferred for threats. "I should perhaps have mentioned," he said, "that the Duke has certain obligations outstanding that could, in the wrong hands, become rather public, as could certain facts about the nature of his first marriage, and as could certain facts about the nature of yours." The smile stayed exactly where it was. "I wonder if you have considered how simple it would be for a woman of your particular affliction to have been misrepresented to a duke who was told he was receiving one woman, and received, in fact, quite another. I wonder if you have thought about what that would mean for your family." She met his eyes. She kept her hands still. "I thought perhaps not," he said. "No matter. There is time. I find that there is usually time, if one is patient, for the right understanding to be arrived at. I hope we will not need to be unpleasant." He moved to the door and opened it for her with every courtesy and the expression of a man who has made his point and feels no need to repeat himself. She went. She walked to the still room, because she needed somewhere she could lock a door, and she sat down at the workbench, and she opened her notebook, and she thought. Not about what he had threatened, which she had already, in some part of her, expected. She thought about the letter, which she had read very quickly and entirely, and about a set of apothecary entries in a different hand, and about the word misrepresentation, underlined. She thought about what he did not know that she knew, and what she had not yet been able to prove, and what she needed in order to prove it. She counted 4 things. 2 she had. 1 she could obtain. 1 she needed a witness for, and the witness was in the house. She unlocked the door and went to find Mrs. Pollard. The housekeeper was in the linen room. Mira closed the door behind her, took out her notebook, and wrote 2 questions. She watched the housekeeper's face as she read them, and what she saw was a woman who had been carrying something heavy for some time and had not been asked. The thumbnail pressed against the forefinger, the breath drawn in. A decision made. "Sit down, Your Grace, Mrs. Pollard said. I have been waiting for someone to ask." What the housekeeper told her over the following hour was not a complete account of a crime, but was a complete account of an absence, the specific gap in a chain of care, the replaced bottle that she had noted and not been able to explain and had been told to set aside. The doctor who had come twice, but whose visits had not been entered in the household diary for those dates, the entry that was. And she had marked this in her own copy of the calendar, different in its handwriting from every other entry of that month. Mira wrote it all down. She wrote the doctor's name. She wrote the dates. She wrote the bottle and what it had contained according to its label, and what Mrs. Pollard had understood to be the late Duchess's treatment, and the date on which the treatment had changed without the doctor's knowledge, because the doctor had not prescribed the change. When she was finished, she looked at the housekeeper, who looked back at her with the expression of a woman who has been a witness to something she did not understand and has waited 3 years for someone to understand it on her behalf. Mira wrote, "Thank you. You will need to say this again, before the Duke, and others if I ask you. Can you do that?" Mrs. Pollard said, "I can." The plan required 2 things she did not yet have. The first was the original apothecary ledger, not the copy she had found in the supply drawer, but the one the apothecary himself would hold, with his own entries and the notation of who had collected which medicines on which dates. She sent Beck to town with a letter and very specific instructions, and the particular calm of a woman dispatching a trusted general. Beck returned on the 2nd day with the ledger and with a chemist named Mr. Odekirk, who had opinions about the properties of certain alkaloids and was willing to explain them to a titled household, and who confirmed over the still-room table what Mira had suspected since she had first read the supply entries and understood that the amounts were wrong. Not overdosed, adjusted, over 18 months carefully adjusted, in amounts small enough to be mistaken for ordinary variation in a woman already ill, large enough to ensure that she did not, in the end, recover. The second thing she needed was a room. And a day. And the Duke. She had avoided him for 4 days while the pieces assembled themselves, which had required a specific discipline because she had discovered that she did not find it as easy to avoid him as she had expected, which was a fact she noted and set aside for later consideration. On the 5th morning, she went to his study and knocked, which she had not done before, and when he opened the door and looked at her face, something in his expression said that he had known something was coming. She handed him a note. It said, "I need to tell you something. All of it. I need you to let me do that before you speak, and I need you to have no appointment for the next 2 hours." He read it. He stepped back from the door. He said, "I cleared the morning already." She looked at him. "I have been watching you for 4 days," he said. "Whatever you have found, I would prefer to know." She sat down at the chair across from his desk, and he sat at the desk, and she opened the notebook and began. She did not use her voice. She wrote and pointed and showed and turned pages, and he read as she went, and his face was very still in the way that she understood now was the face of a man expending considerable energy on composure. And she watched the energy cost him and did not make it easier by looking away. He read the apothecary entries. He read the doctor's name and the dates. He read the entries for the medicines and what she and Mr. Odekirk had determined about their cumulative effects. He sat with that for what might have been a full minute. "You are certain," he said. She turned a page and showed him the parallel columns, date by date. He put his hands flat on the desk. He looked at them. He said, very quietly, "Corwin." She wrote, "Yes, he has threatened you." He looked up. "He said something to you. I can see that he did." She wrote, "He told me he would expose the misrepresentation of my identity and circumstances of our marriage. He would use it against my family. I want you to know that I am not afraid of it, and I do not want it to change what you do with this information. If you need to annul this arrangement in order to proceed correctly, I will not oppose it. The information is yours. It does not belong to me." He read this twice. He said, "No." She looked at him. "I beg your pardon. No, the information did not come to me in spite of what you are. It came to me because of what you are." And he stopped. He had a habit, she had noticed, of stopping at the edge of certain sentences as if checking whether the ground would hold. He tried again. "What I want is not the subject of this morning. What I want is for Corwin Vane to answer for this in a room that contains a magistrate, witnesses, and every document you have assembled, and I want you to be the one who presents it, because you are the only person in this house who could have found it, and I am not going to do you the discourtesy of pretending otherwise." She looked at him for a long moment. She wrote, "That is what I want as well." "Good," he said. And then, after a pause, the slightest softening. "Are you well?" She considered the question with appropriate seriousness. She wrote, "I am very well. I have found an excellent stillroom and a garden that has not been properly attended to, and I have a great deal of evidence, and I am going to need 2 more days." Something crossed his face that was not the laugh exactly, but was related to it, a first cousin of the laugh, and he said, "Take them." The reckoning happened on a Friday, 9 days before Christmas, which was to say 7 days before the date her mother had given as the expiry of the arrangement, which Mira chose not to find ironic. The room was the library, which was the largest room in the house that was not the great hall, and it contained the following: Edmund Ashcroft, the Duke of Gravenmore. A magistrate named Sir Anthony Breck, who had been called from the neighboring estate with a note that gave him the exact minimum information required to compel him to attend. Mrs. Pollard. Mr. Odekirk the chemist, a solicitor's clerk named Jasper, who was not Vane's solicitor but the Duke's, and who had arrived from London in time to establish the legal shape of what was about to happen. Beck, who had taken a position near the door that communicated perfectly her intentions regarding egress, and Mr. Corwin Vane, who had been told there was a matter of estate business requiring his signature, and who was, as a result, entirely unprepared. Mira stood at the library table. In front of her, the notebook. The duplicate supply ledger. The apothecary's own ledger, brought by Beck and examined and signed by Mr. Odekirk with his notation of professional opinion on the relevant alkaloid entries. The household calendar, with the irregular hand in the dates of the doctor's visits. One letter, in Vane's handwriting, from 3 years previous, found in the late Duchess's private correspondence, which Mira had been the first person to actually read since the Duchess's death, because it had been arranged that no one should. Addressed to the apothecary's boy and describing in precise language what should be delivered to the house and what should be written in which book and what should not be written anywhere at all. This letter Mira had enclosed in the late Duchess's own writing case, which was a small tortoiseshell thing inlaid with ivory that had been found in the bottom drawer of the estate room desk, and which she had recognized from an inventory she had not been authorized to see, but had read anyway, as an object listed in the late Duchess's personal effects. It had a lock. The key was on the Duchess's own keyring, which was in the estate room cabinet where it had apparently sat for 3 years. Mira produced the writing case and placed it on the table and unlocked it with the key in front of every person in the room, and took out the letter and handed it to Sir Anthony Breck without a word. He read it. Vane watched him read it. The composure that Mira had observed across 10 weeks, the perfect, gentle, unshakable composure, began, not to crack, but to thin, the way a surface thins before it gives. Sir Anthony looked up. He looked at Vane. He said, in the voice of a man who has been a magistrate for 20 years and has learned to extract most with least, "This is your hand, Mr. Vane. I have never seen that letter." Vane said. "That is very interesting," Sir Anthony said, "because it is addressed in your hand and signed with your initials and found in a locked case belonging to the late Duchess. Someone could have." "The name of the apothecary's boy," Sir Anthony said. "The boy to whom the letter is addressed. Do you know it?" A pause. The fire moved. One of the candles on the high shelf guttered and straightened. Vane said, "I do not." "Thomas Eder," said Beck from the door, with the pleasantness of a woman producing a king's evidence. "He has a barrow on the market square. He remembers the route very well, as it happens. He has a good memory for a boy of his age." 12. When this delivery was arranged. Vane looked at Beck. He looked at Mira, and what she saw, in the moment that the composure gave way, was not the cruelty she had expected, but something older and smaller and, she thought, genuinely pitiable, the specific grief of a person who has wanted and not been given, and has arranged the wanting into a narrative so long, held that the crime had dissolved inside it. He had wanted the estate. He had wanted the money and the position and the primary standing that had gone to his cousin instead, by accident of birth, by the margin of which branch the inheritance favored, and he had spent 6 years consuming what he could not have, and 3 years ensuring that he could not be caught, and now he was caught, in a library, by a woman who had not been supposed to speak. She watched him understand this, and did not let herself feel the victory of it, because what she felt instead was something quieter and less satisfying and more honest, which was sorrow. Sir Anthony turned to the clerk. The clerk made notations. The accounts were presented. Mira's notebook, opened to the columns, handed to the magistrate, and explained by the notebook's own annotations, which were comprehensive, and the difference between what had been stolen and what the records showed was named in round numbers in a voice that made the room very still. Then Mrs. Pollard spoke, at Sir Anthony's request, in the clear, steady voice of a woman who has been waiting 3 years to say what she knew. She said it without embellishment and without wavering, and when she had finished, she looked at Edmund Ashcroft with an expression that was apology and relief in equal parts, and he looked at the floor and was quiet. The legal disposition took the better part of an hour. Mira sat through it and watched Vane's face and felt, as the hour went on, the sorrow settle into something she had not expected, which was a kind of comprehension. He had loved the estate, in his way. He had loved it the way people love things they have decided they deserve, which was not a real love, but was a feeling nonetheless, and the feeling was, at bottom, recognizable. She had spent 26 years managing the arithmetic of what she deserved, and what she would never be given, and she had managed it differently. And perhaps there was nothing particularly admirable in that, and perhaps there was. But it was not a thing she needed to settle in this room. When it was done, and Sir Anthony had risen, and the clerk had packed his notations, and the solicitor had been given his instructions, and Mrs. Pollard had been excused with a warmth from the Duke that the housekeeper received with the efficient restraint of a woman who will allow herself to feel it later, Mira crossed the room to where Vane stood. He looked at her. She looked at him. She wrote in her notebook and showed it to him. It said, "You will receive a quarterly allowance. It is adequate for a comfortable life abroad. You will go by month's end. This is not kindness to you. It is protection for the estate and the staff who are connected to it. I want you to understand the distinction." He read it. He looked at her. Something in his face, for the first and only time, moved without management. He said, "Why?" She wrote, "Because you are not worth what hatred costs." She took the notebook back and left him standing by the window. Edmund Ashcroft was in the hall. He had not left. She had known he would not, and she came through the library door and found him exactly where she had expected, standing with his back to the wall and his arms at his sides, and the expression of a man who has just received a great deal of information and is deciding, with considerable deliberateness, how to carry it. He said, "There is something I should have told you." She waited. The arrangement that was made, I knew within a fortnight of our arrival that the terms were not what I had been told. Mrs. Pollard told me. She has always told me things she thought I needed to know. He looked at the floor. "I did not send you away. I want to be honest about why. I told myself it was because an annulment would have been complicated, and the timing was poor, and I had no suitable alternative. These were true things, but they were not the reason." He paused. He was at one of the edges he sometimes reached. I had not had reason to look forward to a conversation since, I could not remember since when. And you had given me one every day. She thought about what to write and did not write any of it. She looked at him instead. He said, "I am aware that you have been in a position that was not of your choosing, and that nothing I have said removes that. I am aware that you have had to manage a deception that was not your deception, and that it has cost you, and I intend to be honest about the fact that I have known and said nothing, because I want you to have the full account of my conduct in this." He met her eyes. "I am not asking you for anything. I want to be clear about that. Whatever you choose to do with this information is yours to decide." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about everything she had written in the notebook that was now in her hand, and all the things she had not written, and the artemisia in the garden and the lemon thyme that caught the light, and the first laugh, which she had witnessed and not forgotten. She thought about a man who said, "I owe you an honest house," and then gave her the accounts when she asked and cleared the morning, and said not, "I will present this, but you are the one who could have found it," and I will not pretend otherwise. She opened the notebook and wrote, slowly and with care, taking her time, I have a voice. I have always had a voice. I want you to know that first, because I intend to use it. He read it. He was very still. She spoke. She had a voice that had not been used for social purposes in nearly 3 months, and was therefore somewhat uncertain of its pacing, but the quality was what it had always been, which was low and even, and she had been told, rather difficult to dismiss once it had started. She said, I was not going to give it to a family that did not deserve it. I am not certain yet whether you deserve it either, but I think I should like to find out if you are willing to let me. On the understanding that I am not choosing this because of what has happened today, or because you have been kind, or because you have given me an honest house, or because the terms of any arrangement require it. I am choosing it because I wish to. Those are the only terms I will take. Something happened in his face that was not composure failing, and not the laugh, and was not exactly any of the things she had named and filed over 10 weeks, but was instead new information, and it was the best kind, the kind that required a new column in the ledger. He said, Then we are agreed. They were married quietly in the estate chapel on the 23rd of December, which was 2 days before Christmas and 5 days before the deadline that ceased, as of that morning, to be relevant. Mrs. Pollard wept with the efficient dispatch of a woman who has allocated a specific interval for the purpose and intends to honor it. Beck stood at the back with her thumbnail against her forefinger and her eyes very bright, and did not weep, which was the highest compliment she had in her vocabulary. Old Mr. Parsons attended because no one thought to tell him not to, and stood at the door in his best coat, and said afterward, with the authority of a man who has seen considerable weather, that it was the most sensible wedding he had attended in 40 years, which he meant as the highest possible praise, and which it was. Mr. Corwin Vane left the estate on the 28th of December. The allowance was arranged as promised. He was settled some months later in a town on the continent where he was understood to have taken up a modest position with a counting house, which was, Mira thought, an appropriately documentary profession for a man whose crimes had all been committed in ledgers. She did not wish him well, precisely, but she did not wish him ill, and that was sufficient. The redeemable rival was a woman named Miss Aldecroft, who was a cousin of the late Lady Aldecroft, and who had watched the whole business with the cold precision of someone who has lost an advantage and is deciding whether to resent it. She came to call in January and sat across from Mira in the East Room and said, with a directness Mira respected, I was told you were simple. I was told you were meek. I was told a great many things about you, and I can see now that every one of them was an invention of convenience. I would very much like to not be your enemy, if it is at all possible. She had good hands and a straightforward eye, and Mira thought she might make something useful of herself if she was given the right materials. They arrived at a species of understanding before the tea was finished, which endured. Beck remained as she had always remained, without discussion or arrangement. She reorganized the still room to her own satisfaction and had opinions about the lavender supply, and was the first person in the household, the following autumn, to note that the Artemisia had seated itself into 3 new beds along the south wall, which she took as a sign of something, though she was characteristically reluctant to specify what. She was given a raise she had not asked for, and received it with an expression that suggested she had already incorporated it into her calculations. Mrs. Pollard's calendar notation, the entry in the different hand, was entered formally into the magistrate's record and stood as the document it had always been, evidence of the one moment when the truth had been nearly buried and had survived because someone had simply written down what she saw. Mira thought about this more than once in the months that followed, the small heroism of it, the weight of the preserved fact. The garden was attended to in spring, which turned out to require rather less work than either of them had thought, because the bones of the thing were sound, and most of what looked like disorder was merely growth that had been left to its own logic. The lemon thyme spread along the south edge and smelled, in the heat of July, extraordinarily good. There was a wren that took up residence in the far corner by the artemisia and disputed the borders of its territory with a ferocity entirely out of proportion to its size, and Edmund, passing one morning with his hands full of correspondence, paused to observe it and said, without looking at Mira, I recognize that bird, and she said, it is a very determined bird, and he said, I have some sympathy for it, and that was the whole of the conversation, but she thought about it afterward in the way she thought about things that had said more than their words. The late Duchess's writing case was placed on the shelf in the library, locked, with the key hung beside it on a hook. It seemed wrong to put it away entirely, and wrong to use it for anything else, and right that it should be in the room where the letter had been read. No one discussed this arrangement. It was simply where the case went. At midsummer, a year and 2 weeks after the coach had turned south and east, and she had written thank you in a notebook and turned it toward a man who had not made anything of it, Mira came down to the kitchen garden in the early morning for rosemary, which she needed for a preparation she was working on in the still room, and found Edmund Ashcroft already there, standing in the light that the morning was just making, looking at nothing in particular, or perhaps at the lemon thyme, which was glowing again with the same quality of light it had had in the autumn, and that she had thought then was particular to that hour of that season. He turned when he heard her step. He said, I was going to find you. She said, you have found me. He said, I have. They stood in the kitchen garden in the early light for a while without speaking, and the wren in the far corner disputed something with a force entirely its own, and the rosemary was where it had always been, and overhead the sky was doing what the sky does in summer when the day has just started, and everything is still deciding what it will become. She had been the one nobody crossed the room for, once in a house that was not this one. She thought about it sometimes, not with grief, but with the particular calm of a ledger that has been settled and closed. The accounts were honest now. She had checked them herself. If this story gave you the warmth of a lamp held by someone who finally said your name right, then you know what lived at the heart of it. There is a chair here, kept for you, the fire still breathing, the kettle where it always is. Tell me in the comments what you would have done the moment she set that notebook on the table in the library, the one who stayed quiet the longest, or the one who came into the garden to find her. I read every word you leave here, and I am glad of the company. If you wish to keep a place by the fire, a quiet subscription is how that's done. It keeps the candle lit and lets me know there is someone worth telling the next story to. Sleep well tonight, and be gentle with the ones who kept their lamp burning even when nobody asked them to. Until next time.